Three. All right, we're live. So welcome everyone. This is FTF consensus number 7. We have Tobias Klenze presenting Cadence, the new MCP protocol from Category Labs, Monad blockchain. Tobias, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Sam, and it's a pleasure to be on this podcast. I've attended some of the previous talks and always thought it was kind of very enriching. So I'm happy to talk about Cadence. So this was developed at Category Labs, which is, as you mentioned, is kind of the technical labs team behind the Monad blockchain, and it's our new consensus architecture, which achieves kind of two things. It's multiple concurrent proposers, as many sort of recent consensus protocols, and then it achieves an arbitrarily low block interval by doing a technique that we call extreme pipelining. All while sort of, it's an optimal resilience protocol and it has optimal fast path latency. This is joint work with many colleagues of mine, wonderful colleagues at Category Labs. I believe Leoba is also in the room. Yeah, I'll kick things off by asking what is actually this multiple concurrent proposer. So if you're kind of following consensus protocols, you might have seen this. Essentially, the idea is that normally in most blockchains that are deployed and popular, there's a single leader in every round that has a lot of authority. So typically you would send your transaction either directly or indirectly to that leader, and then that leader can include your transaction or can drop your transaction at will. And the leader can also reorder the transactions at will. And that's a lot of power that kind of goes against the idea that Monad is working towards, which is to enable fair access to markets that live on chain. So the easiest way of seeing that is, imagine you have an auction that runs on chain and different users submit bids towards that auction. Now, if there's a single leader, that leader can see all the bids, make its own bid, choose to censor all the bids, and then make a tiny bid to win the auction. So very clearly, if you have a single entity that controls access to the auction, then the whole auction design kind of erodes. And MCP is very much a response to that. The idea being that we can split up the part of the role of the leader into multiple entities that each propose a block of transactions. And the property now is that you as a user, you can submit your transaction to any one of those proposers, or in fact, multiple of those proposers. And as long as a single honest party includes, a single honest proposer includes your transaction, you're guaranteed, at least under synchrony, that it will end up in the merged block. So we kind of run a consensus on all the different proposals, and then we end up with a set of proposals, and then we merge those into a block. And this merging step is entirely deterministic. And the properties, again, are kind of twofold. First of all, there's a censorship resistance property. Now, you might have seen sort of censorship resistance properties in the past as well with some protocols prior to MCP, but some of those were a bit more focused on long-term censorship resistance. So, if I submit a transaction, then eventually it gets included. Because we're talking about on-chain auctions here, it's very important that we get this short-term censorship resistance property. So if you're submitting, let's say you have an arbitrage opportunity on block, like that opportunity doesn't live there for very long, right? So it's very important for you to get your bid included at the next opportunity. So that's a short-term censorship resistance property. And then the second property is hiding. And hiding just says that if you're a proposer, you cannot, there's no proposer that has sort of a global view of the other proposers and can react sort of knowing what the other proposals are. So every proposer builds their block of transactions independently and proposes that without having seen the other proposals first. And again, that's kind of needed for fairness purposes. So together, these properties define sort of this MCP problem. We are not the first ones to come up with that. That is prior work, but we're kind of building on this idea that if you want to have fair access to on-chain markets, you really need those two properties. So the setting that we are operating in here is we have a number of validators, n, and up to f of those are Byzantine. So we assume that n equals 3f plus 1. So we have an optimal resilience protocol. And then there's the concept of a slot. The slot produces exactly one block, right? So there's a one-to-one correspondence between slots and blocks. And each slot is responsible for finalizing exactly one block, and then they get chained together after they're produced. We envision that there will be a few concurrent proposers per slot, but not necessarily all validators. There are some protocols out there that have every validator propose at every single moment, but that's not necessarily what we envision. We will most likely have a smaller set, maybe 5 or 10 or maybe 20 different concurrent proposers, and they each make a proposal consisting of a list of transactions. And then once we have run this through consensus and we know which proposals to include, then we can simply merge those transactions. We remove duplicates and we order them according to some deterministic rule, which then gives us the block. And it's sort of, I know many people are probably interested in what exactly this deterministic rule is. I think that's probably going to be something a bit similar to a priority fee, but those concepts are sort of outside strictly of the consensus. Sam, you had a question.
Yeah, quick question. Is this kind of consensus protocol agnostic? Meaning, does it run as a gadget, or is it tied to a specific consensus protocol?
So I'm going to get into that. It's actually a very modular design that we have, where you can plug in any slot consensus that you want, including a 5f+1 protocol if you want to have slightly faster latency at the cost of Byzantine resilience. There's really no the framework is very generic, and you can plug in whatever you want in there. Yeah. Yes. Another question.
So does the proposer know like what's just the order they have? Like, do they know like on P1 or P2 or P3?
The protocol is agnostic to that. It should not really matter which. There's no order between the proposers, right? So in the end of the day, all the proposers whose proposals are included, those proposals get put, they get merged, all the transactions get merged, and they get ordered according to some other type of ordering mechanism, which is entirely deterministic, but it's not the order of the proposers. It's going to be some kind of priority fee, so that if your transaction wants to be at top of block, you're just going to have to bid a higher amount than other transactions.
Yeah, because I think like when we talk about MVV, it's all about the ordering of the transactions. And now you say it's a deterministic order policy, but we don't know what's the policy going to be. And if this is written down the policy, then I think the proposers will try to exploit it, right? Try to somehow, if they can find the opportunity to put their transaction above in front of others or do some front running. So that's why I think maybe I don't know if the ordering of the proposer matters or not.
Well, the property is that if you're a user submitting a transaction with some priority fee, then you're going to be ranked strictly above all the other transactions that have a lower priority fee. So there's no way that the proposers can really influence that, right? I mean, proposers could try to censor certain transactions, but then as long as there's one honest proposer that includes it, it will be included. So it's really, the way that one should think about this is that this power of ordering transactions is being taken away from the leaders and from the proposers.
I see. Thanks.
Of course. Great. Yeah, feel free to interrupt with questions if they're relevant to the current slide as well. Right. So that's the setting. I'm going to give a little bit of sort of historical background of how we arrived at this Cadence protocol. So typically what you have in consensus protocols is you have this 3-round structure. You have a propose phase where you have, let's say, a single leader who proposes a block. Then you have one round of voting on that. And then in order to finalize it, you need another round of voting. And then once you have finalized a block, you can move on to the next, to producing the next block. So you start anew from that. And that gives you something where the latency essentially for finalization is 3 rounds, but also the block interval is 3 rounds, which has the effect that if you're a user who submits the transactions and it arrives just after a proposal has been made, you need to wait not only for the 3 rounds for finalization, but also for another 3 rounds in order to get included in the next block, right? So historically, what consensus protocols have tried to do is they introduce this concept of pipelining, where you overlay the production of the next block with the consensus round that is currently ongoing. This can be done by pipelining the second vote that you do. There's some proposals even that have that overlay the first round of voting, right? So you can propose as quickly as you as soon as you've observed the previous proposal. But this is sort of traditionally how pipelining has been proposed. Mikhail, there's a question.
Yes, sorry, I'm coming back to the ordering. So you said it's a deterministic ordering, right? And does it mean it's inside consensus? So the non-proposer validators are checking like the final transaction ordering inside the block or not?
They are eventually. So we have what's called asynchronous execution. So we do not execute prior to voting. And what that means is that also the ordering of the transactions, it's a deterministic step, but it happens sort of outside of consensus. So consensus essentially just establishes which proposals are included in the block. And then there is the translation phase that comes after consensus that does the merging, the deduplication, the ordering, and then we execute it, and then we still have a vote on the execution result, but that happens sort of asynchronously with some amount of delay. So you're not immediately putting the ordering through consensus itself.
Okay, so you only vote on the execution results, but not on the the ordering results, right?
Right, but if the execution result is the same, then the ordering is well. You're voting on the consensus block itself, which is the consensus. Sorry, the translated block as well, and that translated block does contain the ordering. So you are voting as well on the ordering. You're just not voting immediately on that round. We don't want to wait before we finalize. We don't want to wait until the order has been established.
I see. Okay, so that is like implicit voting on the ordering, basically.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, because the way I see it, it just pushes it to the source of truth, right? Like if you're, because if like enough of the validators or proposers are proposing the same exact block, assuming no censorship, that I think that's the intuition behind it being called deterministic ordering, if I'm not wrong.
I didn't get the first part acoustically, unfortunately.
Sorry, the way I see it, it's just like pushing it towards kind of like a source of truth, right? The order of transactions. So I think the intuition behind this being a deterministic transaction ordering is because it's like the transactions are supposedly the same, assuming there's no censorship, no attacks in the middle. I think that's the intuition. That's where it comes from. I'm just trying to confirm it.
Right. I think the intuition is that essentially, what is the job of consensus, right? And I think that's maybe like a slightly philosophical question, but it's one sort of worth getting into. I think from our perspective, the job of consensus is to agree on some common output that everyone agrees on, such that that output is not necessarily what you directly execute, but you can get from that output to the execution in a deterministic way, right? So if I tell you, hey, these proposals are going to be included, and there's some deterministic transformation that we do, then that's okay, because every validator will faithfully, follow that deterministic translation. And the same way that we deterministically execute, right? Now, of course, there could be a bug in the translation, or there could be a bug in the execution, But if there is such a bug, then eventually the execution result would mismatch, and or the translated blocks would mismatch. And then in a later round, when we run consensus over the execution result, we would find out that there's a mismatch. So that's roughly how I would think about it, right? The job of execution is just to come up with some result that that everyone agrees on, and that from that you can deterministically do the remaining steps that are necessary to sort of run your full blockchain.
Exactly. That's pretty much what I meant. You said it way better than I did. Thank you.
Okay, great, for sure. Maybe it makes sense if there's more questions around this ordering. Maybe it makes sense to discuss it towards the end, just to make sure that I can go through these slides. Right. So to recap quickly, initially consensus looked a bit like this, and then people came up with ways of pipelining it. And what that saves you is not the finalization latency. What it saves you is the inclusion latency. So how long do you have to wait as a user until the next block is produced, so that you can be included in that? And now we could try to come up with some simple MCP protocol that just simply follows similar ideas. So we have 3 rounds. We have the voting, the proposed, the voting, and the finalization. And now the idea is that there's multiple proposers. So this only kind of works if everyone agrees on the same set of proposals being received. So this just kind of shows what's called the happy path. If there's mismatches, then it gets more complicated. But in like the best case scenario, it looks like this, right? Now, there's one initial problem that you have with this, which is that, let's say you finalize a block. That block consists of multiple proposals, each, sorry, now I'm talking about how would you pipeline this? Okay, so imagine if you pipeline this. Each proposal defines a parent, right? But if there's a single proposal, like a single leader, once you finalize a block, you have finalized implicitly the entire chain leading up to that proposal. If you have multiple proposers, you have multiple parents. So the pipelining does make things actually harder in terms of consensus. So that's the first reason why pipelining MCP protocols is not super straightforward. But there's another reason which we discovered through some simulation that actually kind of caused us to abandon this line of reasoning and to choose a different approach instead. Which is that, so here I've drawn this out as like 3 rounds: propose, vote, and finalize, and they each have a delta, which is how you would look at it in theory. But in reality, the picture looks a little bit more like this. So you have the proposal times are much longer than the votes and the finalize. And the reason for this is because most proof-of-stake blockchains, they have the stake somewhat concentrated in geographical areas that are well connected. So in most blockchains, 2/3 of the stake is in Europe plus North America, and they're well connected. They are able to achieve a quorum certificate, so like 2/3 of the votes, quite quickly amongst each other. Whereas the proposers are drawn randomly from the entire validator set, right? And so if you, let's say you have 10 proposers, you pick out, like most likely, many of those will be in well-connected areas, but if you have 10 proposers, it's very likely you will pick out one proposer who is in a really far away location, and you essentially have to pay the round trip time from most of the network to that person and back, right? And that adds a lot of latency because of the way that sort of global latencies are distributed. So in reality, if you try to apply this concept of pipelining to an MCP protocol, what you would effectively do is you would parallelize this or even this thing, right? But you would cut down on the part that is like the fastest thing, right? The vote latency. The proposal latency is still really, really low. And we realized this when we were doing simulations that the limiting factor here is really the block interval. For the block interval is the slowest proposer, right? And if you have a single proposer, maybe on average you're fine. But if you have many proposers, there will just inevitably be one slow proposer among them, and that one will dominate the latency for the whole protocol. There are other reasons why maybe such a responsive protocol design is not the best. There's timing games. I won't get into that, but essentially there is this fundamental problem that you're limited by the slowest validator in your set. And so what we came up with, I guess independently with other people, is this concept of extreme pipelining, where we say, let's abandon the thought that you need to know the previous proposal in order to propose, or the previous block, right? So let's say we just schedule these slots using synchronized clocks at regular intervals, and you don't need to know what the previous block is in order to propose, because what is a proposal? A proposal is simply a list of transactions, and it's not required that you know the prior proposals. There will, of course, be potentially some duplication, to which we have good ideas of how to mitigate that. But in principle, you know, we can completely freely now set this block interval. So we can make it arbitrarily long or short. And what this cuts down on, again, is not the finalization latency, because that's determined by how long does it take to finalize a single block, but rather the inclusion latency. How long do I need to wait until the next block is produced? Because that one is determined by the block interval. Right, so we get rid of the chaining at the level of consensus. We do have some mechanism, I'll talk about this later, we do have some mechanism of making sure that we don't go completely crazy. And, you know, imagine if we had this really a small interval and we started opening new consensus instances at an unbounded number of them. That would be really bad. So we do have a mechanism to kind of make sure that everything stays bounded. But in principle, we just schedule new slots at a regular cadence, hence the name. And each instance operates on its own without knowing about the previous instances. So that's the first part. And the second part is that we synchronize on the deadlines, not the proposal times. And the effect that that has is we're no longer waiting on the slowest proposer, right? So what the deadline says is there's a deadline and at which all the validators vote simultaneously. And they vote yes for the proposals they have received, and they vote no for the proposals they haven't received. And what that means is if a proposer who is very well connected to all the other validators, you can propose a little bit later. If you're somewhere in a geographical area where you have really high latencies, all you have to do is propose a little bit earlier. You can still participate in consensus and make proposals. You just have to adjust your proposal times accordingly. Yes, question?
So this is based on the assumption that there is a global clock between all the validators?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah. Sam?
Yeah, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, I guess at the last. Oh yeah, this worked. So is the assumption here that you need to wait to have seen all the proposals before you vote? Like, why can't you just vote before you know? I guess the idea what you're saying is in order to vote before, you need to have a timeout in order to kind of for the others to know whether you've waited enough, or why can't you just, you know, in normal pipelining you could just say like, oh, I've seen 2/3 of the proposal, that's good enough, like I'm gonna vote.
Right. You could do that, but then you don't get the censorship resistance property, right? The censorship resistance property says if I'm an honest proposer and I make a proposal, my proposal will be included. Now, if you're saying, oh, I've observed 2/3 of the proposals and I'm just going to cast my vote, effectively what that means is if you're a proposer in Australia, like none of your proposals are ever going to be included because you're always going to be like slower than 2/3 of the 2/3 of the proposals, right? So we need to really make sure that this interval here needs to be large enough such that even, and it has a timeout as well, right? But that timeout needs to be large enough such that the slowest validator in your system, if they become a proposer, they have enough time to propose. Otherwise, you're not fulfilling censorship resistance.
I see. And so then your fix is just to make that slower, to make, sorry, that interval kind of smaller, but then to say, oh, you're allowed to start kind of sending proposals before the timeout. That's basically what's happening more.
So the crucial point here is that it's no longer like in this picture here. Essentially, let's say you're this proposer here, right? You send your proposal out, and then essentially you have some dead time because you need to wait for the slowest proposer, right? This doesn't happen in extreme pipelining anymore because we synchronize on the deadline of when you should have received your proposal or the proposals as a validator, right? So if you're a fast proposer with really low latency to everyone else, you can propose later. If you're a very slow proposer, you have to propose earlier. It's ultimately your choice when you propose, but that's how it works out with the latencies. And we kind of believe that that's the best you can do, right? I mean, you cannot do anything about the fact that validators in certain geographical locations have higher latencies than others. But we guarantee that if you propose early enough under synchrony, your proposal will be included without slowing down any other proposals, right? If your proposal is really well connected, you can propose later. Now, why is it good if you propose later? It's good because you can include more recent transactions. So for the users that are close to you, the effective end-to-end latency drops because they don't have this dead space of waiting.
I'm just curious about the. Oh, sorry, I don't know.
Go
if I
ahead.
interrupted. I'm just curious about the validator side now, the voting side now. Don't they suffer from the same exact problem? Like, let's say you have all these proposals here. Well, like, is there any study done for the liveness constraints? Like, let's say I have like 5 different or 10 different consensus instances set up, right? And then I have all these messages coming to me, and I'm not able to answer, like, pass my messages back within the delta that I have. And so that essentially is like I'm not adversarial at all, but I'm just, I'm not live, at least for that consensus. Is that something that's dealt with?
So you mean if we're under asynchrony, then there could be more message delays. That's true. I mean, that affects any consensus protocol.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the concern is that we have multiple consensus instances going on at the same time, and that could create an extra sort of workload on in terms of compute and bandwidth and those things. And that's then again, like, that's just a matter of fixing the block interval, right? So if you go all the way down here, it could be that there's many consensus instances open at the same time. And then indeed, if you lower this block interval too much, it could be that you exceed the available bandwidth and the available compute of the validators. So the fix to that is to just choose a block interval where you ensure that each validator can sort of, within its bounded resources, participate in the protocol.
So you're bounded by the slowest proposer as well as the slowest validator, right? Kind of like that?
Well, the important thing is, so for the proposals, like, let's go back to this picture, right? Here we needed to wait for all the proposers. Essentially, you need to wait for all the proposers because you want to make sure that if there's a single slow proposer, they still have a chance of being included. But when it comes to the votes, for the votes, you're okay with just having, 2f+1 votes. Like, once you've collected 2/3 of the votes, you can move on. You don't need to wait until you've received all the votes. If you have received 2f+1 matching votes, you can move on to the next round, which allows this voting phase here to be very fast.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense then.
Yeah. But that was a good question, right? So, like, why is the voting phase faster? You don't have to wait for everyone, just the fastest 2f+1. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Were there more questions?
Yeah. So I was wondering what's
Rohan, you're like third in the queue. I think Kevin.
I mean, you might cover this later, but how do you deal with like duplication and the fact that like the slowest proposer might be including a lot of things that the previous proposer already included?
Yeah, let's get to that. There are mechanisms we have. It's more a question of mechanism design. How do you incentivize, users? Like, how do you charge users for multiple inclusions? That's sort of outside of, I would say, the consensus in a narrow sense. But maybe we can talk about that later.
Okay, that's fine.
Mikhail?
Yeah, so you basically like disconnected the proposal from the execution here, right? Because like the next block proposals, they do not reference any previous like execution results, which means like the block proposal is completely separate from execution, or it is not completely separate. So you have somehow you kind of reference the previous execution results at some point.
That's a great question. So the consensus protocol doesn't really care about it in theory. In practice, what we do is we have a delayed execution result. So you don't include the execution result of the previous block. You couldn't do that because that wouldn't allow you to lower this block interval arbitrarily low. But you include the execution result of some delayed state route. So for example, you could say we include the execution result from 10 slots ago, right? And so then if each slot is 100 milliseconds, that would be from like 1 second ago. So you do include that, but how exactly that's defined, that's ultimately a configuration question.
Okay, so it's out of consensus, at least on paper, but in real life it is possible. Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yes, we do eventually want to actually reach consensus over the execution result as well. We just don't want to wait for it while we're producing new blocks. Okay, great. I think I might have to speed up a little bit. Right, so the overall architecture that we have is we have this extreme pipelining framework, which consists of a slot consensus. The slot consensus is responsible for just producing and finalizing a single block, right? And we instantiate that with the CORS protocol. CORS is an MCP single shot consensus protocol. What does that mean? It has multiple proposers, but crucially, it's only responsible for ever producing a single block, right? Most consensus protocols, they are multi-shot consensus protocols. They keep producing new blocks, at least in the blockchain realm, right? But this is sort of easier from the perspective that we only need to think about one block at a time. We don't need to think about how one block is a parent of another block. That's completely abstract and not required for CORS to think about. And inside CORS, we will have a fallback consensus, which I will get to as well. So that's the slot consensus on one hand side that just deals with a single slot. And then the orchestrator, which we instantiate with a protocol that we call Conductor. That one schedules the opening of new slots, new deadlines, and it is responsible for ensuring that everything stays bounded, right? So if we started opening new slots at a regular cadence, but somehow finalization is really slow due to asynchrony, that could grow unboundedly, the size of the state. And Conductor ensures that we only open a bounded number of we only have a bounded number of slots open at any given time. Now, what's important here is that we can actually, you can swap out these parts, right? So you can have a different orchestrator if you wanted to, that has different properties. You can have a different slot consensus. I mentioned you can have a 5F+1 protocol in there. You could have a leader-based protocol in there, right? There's nothing that tells you that this has to be MCP. So it's really quite flexible. Yes, is there another question? Okay. Well, Rohan?
Yeah, I had one question in the previous slide. I was wondering, probably this is out of consensus, but I'm just wondering, like, if the block slot actually starts at some time when an existing slot is open, what is the rationale behind anyone sending transactions to any proposers in one of this slot and not something which finalizes before the current slot? For example, I see that in the current diagram, at DS+1, there are 2 slots open, which is the slot which finalizes at DS+1 and also a new slot which started before DS actually. So what's the, like, theoretically, like, the slot is actually open and like you have enough time to propose, but practically I'm just considering maybe like no validator actually receives enough transactions to populate their mini block and send it across in time. So practically, probably they start only receiving transactions after the previous slot is fully closed.
Right. So the way that we envision this will work, again, this is kind of a question of how do you run this in practice. But we envision there will be semi-stable leaders. So instead of having, semi-stable proposer sets. So instead of rotating out the proposers with every single slot, if you're a proposer, you're not just a proposer for a single slot, but maybe, I don't know, 10 slots or 20 slots or some number of slots, such that if you're a user, you can send your transaction to some proposer, and that proposer can include it in the next slot that is being built. But you don't have to, if the block time is 100 milliseconds, you don't have to time it exactly that you hit that proposer of that slot, because we have these semi-stable proposers. Okay, great. Let me speed up here a little bit. Right, so we have in cores, now I'm going to talk about the single slot, right? So we're just talking about the production of one block. And what happens is at the deadline, everyone votes per proposer. And if you then, as a validator, if you're able to form a certificate, a 2f+1 certificate for each proposer, then you build what we call a fast meta block. It's a meta block because it contains not actually the transaction payload, but rather some digest of them. And with one more round of voting on that fast meta block, we can finalize it. So it has these 3 rounds that we previously saw as well. If that's not the case, then we need to revert back to some fallback path, which I'm going to talk about later. Right. So how does this look like concretely? So this is a simple example. By the way, all these, or most of these examples are also on the website that we put out for Cadence, so you can play around with that. You have 10 proposers here, sorry, 3 proposers, 10 validators. They each broadcast what's called their chunk. So the chunk is a compact representation of the block proposal that also contains some data. So it ensures data availability, essentially. And then at the deadline, if you're a validator, you're just looking at which proposer did I receive a proposal from, and you vote yes for all of those, and you vote no on the ones where you didn't receive a proposal. So in this example, everyone's honest, everyone's sending out their proposal among the 3 proposers. And so you build this 2f+1 certificate for each of the proposers, and then you build this fast meta block consisting of 1 strong certificate per proposer, and then 1 more round of voting on that finalizes the whole thing. Now, what happens if there's a single validator, P3 here, who's offline? Naively, you might think that this means that we can't finalize on the fast path anymore because we have an offline validator, or that there's some kind of timeout that causes extra delays. The nice thing about Cadence is that neither is the case. We can still finalize on the fast path, and we still only wait until the deadline, right? So there's no extra timeout. The deadline is kind of the timeout. And if we haven't received the proposal until then we simply vote no on that proposer. And since no one has received any chunk from P3, everyone votes no on it. And so we are able to build a strong, this 2f+1 certificate for exclusion. And because of that, we're still able to build this fast meta block, right? So the important point is here that if we, you could imagine if we increase the number of proposers, at some point it becomes more likely that one of those proposers is offline. But it's actually not a problem for us. We are still able to finalize on the fast path. Now, there is a case where we cannot finalize on the fast path, unfortunately, which is when there's a proposer that has what we call partially proposes. So if you're a proposer and let's say there's 10 validators, 5 of them receive the proposal, 5 of them do not, then you can't really, half of them will vote yes, half vote no. You're unable to form either of the 2 certificates. So then you can't really, finalize on the fast path anymore. And the reason why a proposer might do this is because either they're Byzantine or because they propose too late, right? So if you do propose, but you propose so late that not all the honest validators receive your proposal, then indeed this could be triggered. And we envision there will be incentives to disincentivize it should incentivize timely proposals so that this doesn't happen. The fallback path means that after some timeout after the deadline, if I haven't formed a fast meta block, then I send this broadcast this message called no fast vote, and it once I've collected 2f+ 2f+1 of those, then that means that the fast path won't commit, because once you cast that message, you essentially give up on, you will not send a fast commit vote. And right, so it essentially tells us, hey, once you've received 2f+1 of those no fast votes messages, then you know that it's kind of safe to use the fallback mechanism to finalize a different block. And we collect some kind of evidence. I'm just going to go very quickly over this. Essentially, collect the strongest evidence that you can, even if it's with less than 2f+1 votes in agreement. And then you include that in a meta block that's now what's called a fallback meta block. And then we run a fallback consensus on that. So each validator has some kind of meta block that has as an input to the fallback consensus. And then that outputs something that gets finalized. And now you might ask yourself, well, aren't we cheating here? Isn't the fallback consensus, like, isn't that just another, like, we draw it here as a black box, but that's like another consensus protocol that we have to instantiate somehow. But the point is that this fallback consensus protocol is now, it can be a normal, single leader protocol. It doesn't need to be an MCP protocol. So we've reduced the problem of MCP down to the simpler problem of, like, okay, there's just like a single block that we have to decide on. We don't have to decide on a set of proposals anymore. We just have to decide on some meta block. Okay, so coming to the conductor, so that was the slot consensus. That's just for one single slot. Yes, there's a question.
So here the small blue blocks are the chunks. The chunks are basically the block proposal by some proposers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here I'm just wondering what exactly are those validators are voting for. So because in the normal consensus, we vote for, like, if we don't see the equivocation, if we see the block is like valid, like this can be shown as it is. But in the current MCP, first, like, you don't even know what's gonna be finalized, because, like, there is even though you say it's a deterministic merging in the end, but from a validator perspective, I don't know what exactly gonna happen in the end. So how do I decide if I should vote or not? Like, also, like, this is multi-proposal, so this is somehow equivocation by default, right? So maybe I used this word in a wrong way, but you got my idea, I think.
So it's a good point. So what we're deciding on is actually not the contents of the proposal, but rather some smaller digest. Plus, we have a separate data availability guarantee. Okay. So what that means is essentially we are deciding not on the entire proposal of transactions. The reason why we don't do that is because that would create a lot of bandwidth constraints on the proposers. They would have to sort of broadcast their proposals in clear text, and those proposals can be very large. So instead, what we do is we use an erasure encoding, encode it down into smaller chunks, and then give each validator one chunk. And in addition to this chunk, they get a Merkle proof of inclusion, and the proposer signs the root of that Merkle proof, of that Merkle tree, right? So it's exactly one Merkle tree for each proposal, and what you're agreeing on is the root of that Merkle tree. Okay. Now, separately, we have a mechanism that ensures the data availability, because it's not helpful if we all agree that the Merkle root is some value, but there are not enough chunks to obtain the actual data behind it. So what we guarantee is that whenever someone finalizes a block, a meta block, then we can recover all of the necessary data to obtain those transactions. So that's the data availability guarantee that we obtain. And the reason we separate this is for latency reasons, because we don't want to first disseminate the data and then agree on it. We agree on the digest, and we create this certificate that proves the availability of the data separately.
So voting basically is giving a signature on this is a valid proof, and that's it.
So say again.
So a validator's vote is basically just one signature on agreeing on like this proof is valid.
Yeah,
like
you're
this proof
agreeing,
of is valid.
you're agreeing on the Merkle root and the fact that you have locally a valid proof, a valid Merkle proof. Yes, correct.
So by this illustration here, because you are mentioning erasure coding, it's not only like by like let's say this block 3, it's not only not gathering enough certificates, it's also not getting enough chunks to reconstruct the Merkle proof.
So what you're receiving from each proposer is a chunk. That chunk contains the data, the erasure, like one erasure coded symbol, kind of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it contains a Merkle proof and a signature on the root of the Merkle tree. And what you're voting on is the root of the Merkle tree and the fact that you've received data and the fact that you've received a valid proof for that data.
Okay. So there is no data in the erasure coding at all, like no actual payload in the erasure coding at all.
These chunks do contain data, but the point is that the data is much smaller than
it's the digesting stuff, like the actual blockchain transactions.
Right. Yeah. So if you have if you have a very large proposal, essentially the amount of bandwidth that naively, if you have let's say a 1 megabyte proposal and you have 100 validators, the proposer would need to send 100 megabytes, right? One megabyte times 100. But here, essentially, with the erasure encoding, we have like roughly a 3x overhead. So you encode the 1 megabyte proposal into 3 megabytes of chunks, and then you send each validator its chunk. And so the total amount of bandwidth that you're using is just 3 megabytes, which is way more efficient. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
And then at the deadline, everyone broadcasts the chunks that they have received from each of the proposers. All right, Mikhail?
Yeah, so when this situation happens, right, when the mixed vote situation happens, does it renders the valid proposals as invalid, or like basically do we throw them away when we fall back, or is it up to the implementation of the fallback consensus? And basically the follow-up question is this P3 in this case, is it rendered as invalid, or like basically Byzantine proposer on this slot or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a bit up to the protocol design. Essentially, the protocol design, when there's ambiguity, okay, first of all, it could be that either of those could be finalized, right? So if you're a proposer, if less than 2 F+1 validators vote yes on your proposal, you're no longer guaranteed inclusion, right? So the question is, what happens in those certain circumstances where you could be included, but you could also be excluded? And in essence, there's different, there are different tweaks you can make to the protocol to bias it towards one or the other. And we're having a bit of a bias towards inclusion, but this can also change, right? This is sort of, the protocol doesn't necessarily dictate that. That can be tweaked.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know. In the interest of time, maybe I would just skip over the conductor and just ask if there's more questions. Or do we have to end in 4 minutes? Is that correct?
I think we can. People are free to drop, and we can continue for another 15 minutes for questions. And if you wanted to finish, or I think Bowen had a question, we can take Bowen's question.
Yeah, why don't we do questions? I mean, sounds more fun. You can. So the conductor, maybe I just very quickly say what it does is essentially it bounds the number of open slots that are open at any given time. And the way that it does it is that you don't notice it at all if we're under synchrony. So if the networking and consensus, everything goes well, then you don't notice at all that there's even this conductor. You just open the slot at a regular cadence. And then only if there's extreme asynchrony and we're sort of piling up the number of open slots, then at some point the conductor will kick in and it will prevent the opening of new slots until we've made enough progress on the existing slots. And that's the mechanism that we use to ensure that there's a bounded number of slots. Yeah. Okay, let's do questions.
Maybe before the questions, can you quickly summarize the delayed execution and how is it referenced in the implementation?
How is it?
I mean, how do you reference the past block results in the next blocks?
Right. So essentially, the way that we do it is we have this concept of a chain certificate. So note here, if you have most blockchain consensus protocols, if you finalize the block, you have not only finalized that block, you have also implicitly finalized all prior blocks, right? The whole chain is finalized. This is different in Cadence, because in Cadence, once you finalize a slot, a block in a slot, it could be that the previous slot hasn't finalized yet, right? So they're not chained together. So in the paper, we introduce this concept of a chain certificate, which is a different type of certificate that's outside of this core consensus. And that certificate covers essentially a slot plus all the prior slots before it, right? And what it also does is, optionally, we can add this, that it also needs to reference some delayed execution result. For example, the execution from 10 slots ago, right? And so once you have that available, so once you've finalized all slots up to some slot, and you have executed the that slot minus 10th block, then you cast your vote for the chain certificate. Okay, and once we have created the chain certificate, that chain certificate serves as a sort of ticket in order to propose. So if you're making a proposal, you have to prove that that the blockchain has made progress on execution as well, and you have to include a recent chain certificate in order to even have the right to propose. And the reason why we do this is because we don't want consensus to jump ahead and finalize new blocks at a really high rate while execution is falling behind. We want to make sure that even though we have asynchronous execution, and so execution is not always at the forefront at the same level as consensus, we also don't want a case where execution trails behind consensus by too much. So we bound that, and we only allow you to make a new proposal if you can reference a chain certificate from a recent slot. All right, more questions?
Hello. Yeah, you mentioned about the erasure coding part. I mentioned about the bandwidth efficiency. I just wondered by the end, every validator will receive the everyone's proposal, or the merged proposal. Is that correct?
The erasure coding is for every single proposal. Yeah.
Yes. So okay, actually, this is a question I ordered. My question is that how do you prevent wrong wrong encoding, this kind of things? For example, I propose I'm a malicious leader. I encode it maliciously such that even given the theoretical bound, you can reconstruct data. But if you reconstruct the data, the thing doesn't match. The merge doesn't match.
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. I actually have a backup slide on exactly that topic. So what happens is, so let me rephrase the question. So what happens if the encoding itself is invalid due to a Byzantine proposer? That's the question, right? Yeah. Okay. So what happens is, we have the proposal. It's encrypted. I skipped over that part entirely. We have the deadline. After the deadline, we decrypt. Okay. And then we have, let's say we have just 4 chunks. These get assigned 1 to each of the 4 validators. Then each validator broadcasts the chunk that they have received. And now let's assume that we finalize this. That means that 2f plus 1 of the validators agreed on the same state root, right? So they have to have the same state root, at least. Sorry, the same Merkle root. Okay. Now, what happens is, so let's say that everything is correct. So all the chunks were created correctly. once we have received f plus 1, so f plus 1 chunks are actually enough to decode, then you can decode. You decode, and then what you do is you re-encode the proposal. This follows a deterministic encoding. So you decoded the proposal, and then you re-encode it, and then you compute again a Merkle root and check if the Merkle root matches. And only if it matches, it's included. Let's imagine if if the proposer is Byzantine and it creates some chunks that are invalid, right? Those chunks are still under the same Merkle root because we agreed on the Merkle root. But now what happens is essentially you receive maybe the first 2 chunks which are valid. So you are able to decode the proposal, but then the roots differ, right? So once I re-encode the proposal, I will re-encode it correctly because I'm an honest validator. But this original signed root, the one that the proposer signed, had these incorrect chunks, right? So what I will notice is I received valid chunks. I was able to decode the proposal, but if I try to re-encode the proposal, I get a different Merkle root than the one that the seed leader signed or the proposer signed. So I know that something fishy is going on. I know the proposer created an invalid encoding. And in that case, what I will do is I will just deterministically exclude the proposal. So even though the chunks that I received were valid, I can see that some validators received invalid chunks. And because of this, I will just discard the entire proposal deterministically.
A follow-up question here. So basically, every validator will receive or broadcast its own chunk to other validator. Basically, that's about the default action. And if that's the case, then basically everyone's getting the same chunks. I guess the only advantage here is basically you're utilizing the kind of P2P broadcast like property, as opposed to single leader or multiple leader broadcast chunks, which is more better for the single leader because effectively everybody is getting the same chunk. It's just a different mechanism for everybody to get the same chunk. Is that the idea?
I think this mechanism is actually quite independent of the fact that there's multiple proposers. So even if you have just a single proposer, a single leader, you would still want to have some kind of mechanism like this, because crucially what we're doing here is we're just voting on the root, the Merkle root, right? We're not voting on the actual payload. So whenever we finalize a Merkle root, we need to ensure that everyone will sort of deterministically get the same data, right? And that if the encoding is valid, then that data will be the decoded proposal. If there's any kind of mistake in the encoding, then everyone will deterministically observe that by re-encoding the proposal and checking against the Merkle root and then discard it.
Thanks.
By the way, this is not new. This is like dispersed simplex. So if you see the sing-a-song of simplex paper, that's a technique.
Thanks. And so maybe this is a part missing. It's like so there's like, for example, there are 3 proposers. Are there going to be a 3 signed Merkle root, or how many iterator instance of iterator coding are happening here?
So there's one instance of like each proposal is erasure coded separately.
Okay. So basically, in order to ensure that, for example, censorship resistant, property there has to be sufficient, this kind of like a sign root there. And then each validator will sign, otherwise it will be, some kind of like something fishy, because I don't see, for example, I see, suppose that I know there are 5 proposals and I only receive like two proposal error coding, but so as a result, I wouldn't be able to, sign the whole thing because there's not enough threshold. Is that rough the idea?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Of course.
So I had a completely different question. So you mentioned deduplication. I assume that the deduplication occurs after the validators have agreed on the set of transactions for this particular slot. Is that correct?
The deduplication happens after. So the validators, the consensus agrees on the Merkle roots,
Yeah,
And
you
then
agree on a set of transactions, and then you have a deterministic deduplication process that gets you to a sequence of transactions, and the sequence has the property that is deduplicated with respect to the set. Got it. So there's now a famous result from Diamandis and Angeris in 23 that is about most fair consensus orderings. It's really talking in general terms about how those consensus orderings basically, which all those fair algorithms that remove choice from the validators about the sequencing of transactions. And I think it's fair to say that Cadence is one of them, right? And the result is that this doesn't necessarily maximize welfare, and that there's a welfare difference that's usually positive with this class of algorithms. Not a dig on your presentation, which, by the way, very cool algorithm, very cool presentation. It's just that economics result on this particular class of consensus algorithms that you nearly, since the paper is under very reasonable assumptions, you nearly buy into the moment you start designing that class of algorithm. So one of the things that was, one of the small paragraphs that are interesting in the paper is that very often the MEV exploitation moves from trying to exploit the sequencing of transactions to exploiting the set of transactions. So concretely, what does that mean? It means that if I see an arbitrage opportunity, I move from trying to make sure that my arbitrage opportunity gets first in there to trying to think that my arbitrage transaction gets to be the only one that gets included in the block. Very different. I manipulate the set now, right? And so the incentive that I receive now is to basically spam the other proposers with either my transaction, if I manage to get it included with everyone, or dummy transactions that I might actually pay for relatively highly, so that my transaction that legitimately exploits the arbitrage gets the only one to be sequenced in this block. How do you do demand control is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like, I can attempt to answer it. If Lioba is still online, then she might give a better answer than me. Lioba. You're currently muted, I believe.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think for that, so for all transactions essentially that you're including, like whether dummy transactions or duplicates of your own transactions, in general, you should be paying extra for that, if that makes sense. So
yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to pay for duplicates of my own transaction. Now, I would mention that you might want to communicate the incentives for to your the clients here, the wallets relatively cleverly, because if you're thinking dumbly, there is F+1 dishonest, there is F dishonest validators. People are going to try to be included in one slot by spamming your transaction F+1 times to make sure that they're included in the first slot, because they'll hit a honest validator. If they're a little bit more clever, they might do some sampling. If they have some tolerance to a 1 slot, 2 slot, 3 slots delay, and then you realize that duplicating your transaction 3 or 4 times is enough to be guarantee an inclusion into a very reasonable amount of slots. But here, if you're really trying to exploit a rich arbitrage opportunity, you'll be very happy to spam with transactions that are absolute crap, and the cost of that is just being above the average price of the transaction, right?
Yes.
And everybody has this incentive, right? So the game theory tells you that everybody else will notice, oh wait, everybody is going to bid above the average price of the transaction, so I need to bid above that average price of the transaction, and so on and so forth. And you get into very intense spam events around MEV to make sure that only one arbitrating transaction gets in, right? So you've now moved the MEV from trying to raise the sequence to trying to raise the set, drastically increasing the probability that you're going to get spam transactions.
I would not necessarily, I agree with like some of the intuitions you have, but I wouldn't necessarily agree sort of with the outcome. The reason for that is essentially like the validators or proposers, they will look locally, and they will, if it's not like a congestion at the network layer, but just the block space congestion, they will look and see which are the highest paying fees and take those essentially for them to include. So if you have an arbitrage opportunity, you have two choices. You can duplicate yourself, but you also pay like a base fee, which is completely burned. So the proposers never see that. You pay that per duplicate, and this doesn't create incentives for proposers to include you. Anyways, that is just something that goes back to the protocol. And then on top of that, you pay a priority fee in general. And this priority fee is what the proposers see when they're including you, and they will take the highest paying ones. So if you're an arbitrage transaction, you can duplicate yourself many times. Others are doing it as well, or you can just put all your effort into this one transaction, put the high fee on that one, and then everyone will automatically include you essentially. And in the end, if just one of the arbitrageurs does this, yeah, then the others, the strategy of the others wouldn't work anymore essentially. They're just spamming at low cost.
No, not at low cost. They, on the contrary, they would increase the fee, right? So you get a lot of dummy transactions. So the consequence I feel here is you get 10 people that are fighting for the same arbitrage opportunity. Each of those 10 people submits their own transaction at very high priority fees, but also 9 dummy transactions at very high priority fees, which only goal is to burn block space. To make sure that those 9 transactions doing nothing get in rather than the other guys' arbitrage opportunities. They're trying to game the deterministic ordering that you've set by making sure that it's a deterministic ordering between their arbitrage opportunity and 9 dummy transactions, instead of being an arbitrage opportunity between their transaction exploiting the arbitrage and then 9 transactions that are also trying to exploit the arbitrage. In any case, and then it's up to, it would be up, sadly, from the point of view of the MEV exploitant here, of course, it's up to whatever your deterministic ordering comes up with, right? Who wins. They want to make sure, if it's their arbitrage and then 9 dummies, they win automatically. So the challenge here is those 9 dummy transactions are dummy transactions. Then they have a cost in welfare to your blockchain overall, because they are non-productive in some sense. They get validator revenue, they are costly. In fact, they reduce the expected gain that the arbitrator might have from the arbitrage, because they need to pay priority fees to submit those. But they have an immense cost in welfare to the other people that are trying to use the blockchain that don't care about that arbitrage opportunity, because now there's 9 transactions that are burning consensus bandwidth, which is the one limited resource that you're trying to distribute evenly.
Yeah, I think just at a high level, sort of what I'm like, what my thoughts are on this is essentially you're still paying for that as an arbitrageur. So why are you, because some deterministic ordering will again look at like who's paying the highest fee or something. So why are you wasting like part of the money on this dummy block space instead of like going all in on the positioning of your one transaction? Because as long as one arbitrageur is doing this, like these dummy transactions shouldn't be helping, because you're taking like your own fees that you're willing to place and distributing them across the dummies now.
It's a matter of optimization, right? Expectation is probability that I'm including times the gain from the arbitrage opportunity exploitation, and you're trying to bump the probability that you're going to get included by reducing the gain and burning some money. Right? So I can't tell you what that optimization function looks like ahead of time, right? But I can tell you that if there's an efficient way of increasing that probability by excluding somebody else from being in that block at the first slot, then of course it will make sense in some cases to invest that money and forego some of the expected gain from the arbitrage opportunity and reinvest it in packing the block with dummy transactions. But it's a very cool result. I hope we're going to get interesting data on your deterministic ordering, specifically because it's an open question whether there are deterministic ordering that minimize that welfare gap. Right. So I mentioned these original results that basically if you're doing FIFO, or if you're removing from the validators the ability of doing all that this paper proves is that there's a positive gain between there's a positive drop in welfare between the welfare optimization and the pair sequencing, or the class of neutral sequencing algorithms. Cool. So you're going to pay for something for using a consensus that is not leaving the validators any option as to what the ordering is going to look like. But then the question is, how much do you pay? How can you reduce the welfare, the impact on welfare? And depending on your deterministic ordering, it might be a lot or it might be not a lot. That might be interesting.
Yeah, we're also currently working on this still.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, François. I think it would be fun to continue this probably in text in the Telegram group. But yeah, I mean, I don't see how this protocol is the first. Like Sui is doing the same thing as far as I know. They also have already kind of multiple proposals in their in their mysticity, and then they also, as far as I remember, order by gas price. So we could look at that. But so to come back to. Okay, wait. I guess I want to let Rohan ask his question. I think we should drop soon. But I guess my question for you, Tobias, was: what's the state of this protocol? Is it live, or is it? I mean, I guess it's not live, but is it? Are you guys? Is this like more of a POC? Are you surely moving to this? Is this in kind of implementation stage? I guess that's my question.
Great question. So we published the paper a few weeks ago, and currently the engineers are working on some prototype implementation. It seems like the feedback from the Moonlight Foundation and the community has been pretty positive so far. So I think this is clearly the direction we're marching towards. Yeah, stay tuned for kind of further deployments. I guess there will be some further announcements coming up.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks, Rohan.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make some points with respect to Francis's argument. I think the point of spam in MCP is, I guess it's not to do with probably deterministic ordering, but rather like attribution of transaction to user. But I think the idea of if you have deterministic ordering, you're reusing block space for the same transaction is not really a thing on especially Monad today, because or any blockchain which has async execution, because all transactions end up paying the whole gas fee, and irrespective of it being like deterministic ordering or MCP or whatever it is, you can see the results will still be the same, right? Because the fact that like if there are 100 arbitrageurs trying to spam the block space with a single MCP protocol or like whatever hot stuff, it's not going to change anything, because the spam is still going to be there, and the validator, given you have enough priority fee, is incentivized to include all these repeated transactions, and you end up paying all the gas fee, right? It's not like Ethereum where like you can early revert and like just pay 22K. It's not the case. You pay the gas limit on Monad. So I think in any async execution blockchain, the idea of like spam will end up eating useful block space still stays. And I don't think it's like a result of any sort of deterministic ordering. Maybe like, yeah, it would be interesting to understand like how like the category team decides to attribute these sort of like, because there is no real way of like attributing transaction multiplication to either the client or the proposer or like mempool. How this gets multiplied is you can't really like kind of slash like I don't know what exactly the results would be there, but that would be something interesting to learn.
Wait, can you repeat your comment? I guess we can end on this, but I'm not sure Tobias got it based on his face.
All good. I mean, I think these are all things that we are kind of currently working out on. I think we figured out the consensus part to a large extent, and the way that transactions are ordered, and the incentives and the mechanism design, and all these things are things that are still being actively researched. So we have some good ideas, I think, but we're not quite ready to really say that we've decided on any particular design.
There's one thing that is very cool, though, is that if you're using coding in order to diffuse transactions, and if you're very sure about it, you can make sure that you don't pay for spam at the block, or for repeated transactions, to be more specific, at the block diffusion. Ideally, because if you do your chunking very cleverly, several identical transactions proposed by different proposers would have similar or the same encodings that you would at the network level know that you don't have to retransmit once again. However, you're going to pay for it in logical block space consumed, right? Because you need to reflect that two different distinct proposers have included the same transaction in the proposal.
Yeah, I think you would also need to kind of completely change the way that we do the encoding, because currently we do the encoding per proposer. So each proposer essentially proposes one block, and that block of transactions, and that gets encoded as one. And if you now say, okay, we're gonna encode every transaction separately, then there's a lot of different trade-offs that pop up. I think it's certainly an interesting idea, but I think it would be quite a departure from how things are currently designed.
So this is something that Blake 3 does to avoid grifting, right? So they have a bit of chunking that is done very cleverly, so that if you have intermediate hashes that give you the target of what you are looking for in the very next chunk. And if the boundaries, and so that you can basically reject a grifting or dummy or an invalid payload by computing an intermediary hash before you collect all of the data up to the end of the file, which leads to your final Blake tree hash. Right? So Blake tree is not the first hashing function that uses that technique, but it's the most famous one, and so you can employ some of the same ITs to basically deduplicate at the per transaction level at the cost of some constraints when the block proposer is doing their encoding. Anyway,
yeah, that's
Mihai has a question.
Thank you.
Let's take one very last one, and we'll end after this. Michael.
Yeah, so you mentioned that every proposer is proposing the whole block. So if the number of block proposer is deterministically known beforehand, and we do chunking basically, why do we force every proposer to propose the whole block instead of like proportionally split the block space between them?
We will split the block space between them, because if you have 10 proposers and you give everyone sort of the full block space, you might end up in the worst case with a block that's 10 times larger than you can sustainably handle. So there will probably be some kind of splitting of block space. There's various different sort of ideas we have for how exactly to do that. You could, the most conservative option is that you say, well, we have 10 proposers, so we're going to give each one of them 1/10 of the gas of a block, but there are possibly other solutions that we're exploring that might allow proposers to include more transactions than that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks again, Tobias. Let's end it here. I think we should continue on the Telegram. I think I'm sure people would love to discuss, but thanks for this. And anyone who's not in the Telegram, please, you can DM me anywhere on Twitter or whatever. I can invite you to the group so we can continue chatting there. Thanks again, Tobias.
All right.
And thanks to you for joining.
Thank you, everyone else. Take care.